Welcome to Kay Elizabeth Toasts, a podcast celebrating people who increase our quality of life. I'm your host, Kay Elizabeth. Each episode is a heartfelt interview of a remarkable person making lives better. Give a listen if you are in need of a dopamine hit, or if you like toast, because this toast's for you. Would you first say who you are and what you do?
My name is Brad White. I am an educator by training, and I consult with schools and principals in public education around the country to help fix schools. And I primarily do that through working with leaders. And so I coach about a dozen education leaders, and then I work with about 6,000 students worth of schools in 5 states. So at a base level, I'm an educational consultant, but I'm a school fixer, I think is probably the simplest way to put it.
I love it. Have you heard of the social determinants of health?
Yeah.
Tell me about them.
Geographic, cultural things align to be able to allow people to thrive or not. So anyway,
yeah, I love it.
The thing or not.
No, that's exactly right. So the social determinants of health really come down to 5 different elements, according to the World Health Organization. Right. You've got financial stability, number 1. You've got the social and community context, your built neighborhood, access to healthcare, and access to quality education, which is where I want to spend our time today.
Cool. So
back to the systemic part, all of these public health organizations in the U.S. are really working hard to address systemic issues, right? And what I'm interested in is what individuals do to impact those social determinants of health. So what I was hoping to talk with you about today was specifically the education part. I originally wanted to talk specifically about interventions used to help children and adolescents in school. I'm almost wondering if we should talk about mentoring principals instead.
It's so fun.
What do you do to help address disparities in education? What do you do to help with interventions? What do you do?
What do I do? Yeah, it's been an interesting last year. If I could describe like the types of projects that I'm engaged in, but I think if I zoom out to what do I do in general, I think working in systems that can be incredibly dehumanizing, even though they're incredibly focused on people, is one of the central ironies that I try to work on. So I work on that through being very relational in the work by establishing a foundation of trust, usually between me and the people that I serve, but also helping them to create cultures of trust, where trust isn't just discussed, but it's actually earned and re-nurtured continuously. So I think a lot of times, especially in public education, whether it's a culture between adults and adults and students, we lack a sense of social cohesion and trust and kind of purpose in general. So I tend to focus a lot of my work, even though the outcomes tend to be closing the achievement gap or between students of color and white students. That might be the outcome that we achieve. And a lot of people would tackle that work through setting a strategic plan and working on instructional goals and XYZ, all worthy things. If there's not a foundation of trust, none of that work will succeed, and it certainly won't stick and sustain.
So building trust is obviously a core element. How do you build that trust?
Yeah, so some of this is going to be good old Brené Brown, vulnerability embrace. So I think there's a quote from a person named Parker Palmer, and so I'll misquote him, but it's basically, when you don't know yourself, you can't know others. And so he really focuses on, you need to do work yourself and be aware of that and be as transparent as possible within boundaries about the work that you've done so that you can know others well. And I think that's been a big part of my approach, has been working through and seeing my life through many different lenses, especially as like a pretty dang privileged, straight, white, male, Midwestern Christian. Like I check every box of privilege. And so as somebody who generally doesn't work with anyone who identifies similar to me, I have to be really cognizant of those, not just because I should, but because it works really well because it helps me to see and validate and affirm others in kind of their fullness versus at a surface level. I tend to be pretty open and honest and vulnerable. And that was the Brene Brown piece.
Do you have any recommendations for people to how they can do that?
Well, that's a good question. For me, it's been a lot of reading, listening, therapy, journaling. I think that's a personal journey for each person. Yeah, fishing, like just finding places to allow yourself to do that in a desire to know yourself well.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot. I love the practical question. I don't know. I think it's an individual journey for each person.
Can you think of a specific example of where you moved to that vulnerability and it made it different?
So many. I had 5 leaders pop into my mind as you were finishing the question. So I'm trying to think of which would be the most helpful. There's one other school that it's been around for about 20 years in a southern Midwest state, and was brought in because they were kind of seen as the problem child of the area and that they have the highest potential and the lowest performance. And so they'd been given all these grants over the years that had moved almost none at all. And so folks came in and said, well, Brad, come in and fix the situation. And I said, great, I need 6 months to be able to first just build a relationship.
So wait, so you're saying that the school was the problem?
The school was the problem. They were underperforming and really high potential. And folks would just walk in, pulling their hair out, saying, like, why can't we get the school to improve? And folks were putting in so much time, energy, and money and not seeing any outcomes change.
Yeah.
And so they said, all right, let's try Brad's approach. And they said, okay, well, what are the goals? What are the outcomes? What are the deliverables? And I said, I can work on those, but until we have a trusting relationship, that's not going to work. And I think what's remarkable is we're now about 9 months into that relationship, and that school is now openly saying to me, to the folks that are their funders and support this public school, we need to change. And for almost 20 years, I think they've been in a defensive posture, just trying to kind of survive. In 20 years, the first example that the school and this foundation have had of success, and that's all it took. So, so what
was the success?
Yeah, so now they have fully turned around. They were able to keep a principal for now 3 years when they had gone through 4 in 2 years before that.
Wow.
They had a 90+% teacher retention rate after 3 years in a row of 50% or less. So they had a huge change in terms of people saying, this is a place where I could continue to see myself. And that's enabled them to now say, okay, what can we fix? Spending an uncomfortably long amount of time building a real sense of relationship is worth it left and right with schools, and especially when working with teachers, principals, and students.
It feels like that is a segue into the mentorship of principals that your face just lit up.
Each Thursday I get up at 6 a.m. and I review agendas for 9 different leaders that I work with, and it's really neat. So they each have something.
I just wanted to pause for a moment. You just said I get up at, did you say 6:30?
Mm-hmm.
And you review
all of the agendas that I have with each of the leaders that I coach that day.
And that's really neat. I
love it. It's so fun. It's so cool. But I get up and I read through every one of their agendas, and then I do back-to-back coaching from essentially 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And I just work back-to-back with all these leaders. And I get a chance to do that every week, every Thursday. And it's a really special day of the week.
I can't help but ask about outcomes for this mentorship that you're doing.
80% of the principals that I was initially assigned to work with a year ago had already verbally committed to leaving their schools. 100% of those principals have now returned for a second year, and 100% of them have also committed to next year already.
Wow.
So that alone is like, that's not going to show up on any outcome sheet. It's not going to be there. It just gives the school the space to even be able to do the work that they want to do.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what is the benefit to the school, to the students for having a principal return?
It's massive. So when you have leadership and teacher retention at a high level, it's the foundation that allows for growth. So if you have a constant revolving door of people, and you also have a revolving door of programs, and it's that instability and chaos of constantly being pulled in. We've got a new leader, new direction, new priorities. They're here for 1 year. And then 2 years, and then they're out, and it's a new set and a new set and a new set. And that's where eventually so many educators just get so disillusioned with just like, great, we got a new superintendent. What are they going to say that we're going to focus on? And I know that I'm going to outlast them. So I'm really not going to be invested in this. And so that's where schools end up becoming places very, very resistant to change. If you don't have steady leadership kind of keeping you on a particular track, then you're going to inherently resist change and not change.
And the change that you're talking about that you want, like, can we get to the students? That's what I'm looking for. Yeah. So what is the change that you want to see happen?
When I think about outcomes, I aim for three main things: extraordinary growth for every single kid, no matter their background, for growth to be shared across all lines of difference. So students of color, low-income students, students with disabilities, gifted students, English learners, each of those subgroups will perform at or above the level of the average of the school. And we want to take care of our people while we do it. And I think if you set those three goals and pursue those with everything you've got and try to align to those, that's the work that I try to do. And then at a very specific level with students, there are hundreds of practices that we work on. Everything from how do you help kids learn how to talk to each other? How do you structure conversations to help them learn how to speak, how to listen, how to respond to somebody?
So that reminds me when we're taught how to apologize. Is there any relationship here?
Huge. I think a lot about planting a tree, and I'll talk about that when adults, when I've made a mistake, when a staff member has, when a child has, that we'll talk about, you kind of dug yourself a hole, right? Like you screwed something up, you made a mistake, and imagine now some soil that's now disturbed and there's a hole. Yeah. So what most of our apologies do is they just fill the hole back up, right? So we say, I'm sorry. It might even be that simple, or sorry I hurt your feelings, or sorry that you felt that way. And we just kind of throw,
sorry you were offended.
And we do a pretty crappy job. And frankly, when you walk over a spot that has been dug up and then just kind of filled back in, you can still see it's like it's soft, it's vulnerable, it's not really solid yet. And I think that's how a lot of our apologies feel. It's like it's done the thing, like there's soil there, but it hasn't really restored the soil to what it was before. And so we'll talk about what are the things that ultimately strengthen that soil. Well, actually having a new plant with roots in that spot is one of the most powerful things you can do, literally in terms of planting. So it'll re-strengthen that soil, plant roots, and kind of solidify it again. And so we talk about not only just filling the hole, but then planting a tree there. And that's the symbolic thing that I'll often draw on my whiteboard with a child and say, so what would that look like? So a very tangible example comes to mind. We had a Holocaust survivor come to our school 5 or 6 years ago at a high school in Denver. And as she was sharing, she's in her 90s and is recounting these stories. There were two kids who were just frankly being kids. They were freshmen in high school and they were laughing and joking and, kind of messing around in the back of the room. And it caused some deep pain and hurt and offense to multiple staff members, to all the students around them, and ultimately to this survivor who had come and was very vulnerably sharing a horrific experience. And, the kids could have been doing this in chemistry class. They could have been doing it in any other place, but did not recognize the impact of their behavior in that moment. And so once we got to the point of saying, okay, that wasn't okay, it was then, well, what are we going to do about this? And so they ended up deciding to read two different books, one from Elie Wiesel and I remember the other night, and one other, and then share those lessons with their advisory group, like a small group, about what they had learned, and then take that and actually have a one-on-one conversation with that survivor later on. And we facilitated that follow-up to say, that day I was just distracted and it was really not okay. And I did not mean harm. And also I've now spent all the time to read these two books, to share lessons with my advisory. And I want to come back to talk with you and ask you a few questions. And that is where you plant a tree. The student didn't just learn, you got a wrist slap, you said your apologies, you got a detention, and now you're back in school. But it's no, you're acknowledging that there was real harm. You've filled the hole up with an apology, and you've done some work to plant something new and allow for something beautiful or some growth to come from that. We had some other students who one day pulled the flag off of our campus and, I think threw them up on the roof, and they got all torn up in the process. And the flag has all sorts of meanings. some harmful, some prideful, a lot in between for people.
Mhm.
But I just wanted the kids to know that exists, that to them it wasn't important or it was just a small prank. But we have these two awesome 28 to 32-year-old Iraq vets who lived in the neighborhood, and I got to know them through walking my dogs. And so I just said, could you just spend a half hour with these students and just talk to them about, like, well, what does this mean to you? And it wasn't a guilt trip. It was just a relationship. They ended up getting together 3 or 4 more times after this was done, and just got to know each other, because it was, kind of these 2 older but still cool younger guys who had some real life experience, and then these 2 younger kids who, other folks maybe wrote off as just troublemakers. But we gave them an opportunity to build relationship, to actually learn a thing. And if we had just done the systemic thing, which is suspend the kid, tell them they can't come to school for 2 days, and then that we think is going to fix it, it's not going to do a thing. So we try to be really attuned to, what are we actually trying to accomplish? What is the real goal? Okay, what's the relationship? And then what best resolves that?
Those are powerful examples. So in the spirit of gratitude, I wonder if there's someone that you would be interested in thanking for how they've impacted you in your education.
That is a powerful question to ask. And again, the list of people and the amount of people whose images just came into my mind is long. Like, there are a lot of people out there. I am who I am because of the people who have invested in me and loved me and supported me. And my grandmother Zell, she's, coming up on 97 years old, still lives independently. Every time I'm with her, she teaches me something. Dr. Chin was somebody who started a school a few years after me and allowed for me to be a partner with her. She built her own school, and now is helping me to connect with schools that also mean kind of what we know works. Bryant McKellips and Leslie Patino were 2 of my teachers that I had when I was a kid. And Leslie Patino is the reason why I am such a justice-oriented person. She taught me Spanish, and that helped me as this suburban white kid to get out of my cultural framework and start building bridges across lines of race and culture and language. And I owe all of that to her. Bryant McKellips was the teacher that lit the fire in me for learning and physics, even though it was one of the hardest areas for me to learn. And I struggled. I was fascinated because of his teaching and his passion. So it is very hard for me to just say who is a person that I can thank, but the most powerful of all of those is my grandmother. She's an incredible human being. She's lived through nearly a century, and is always the person that teaches me the deepest and most valuable lessons, most of which is I'm always loved, seen, supported, and maybe I need to chill out a little bit because things are going to change and they're going to get better. And she's an extraordinary person.
So, Fred, this toast's for you.
Hey, breaking bread is pretty important.
Thank you for finding a way to take your individual self and making a larger impact. Now it's time for your toast.
Hi, this is Leif Euland, and I would like to toast somebody I've never had the pleasure of meeting, Scott Harrison, who is the founder of Charity Water, that is doing amazing things to help access to clean drinking water. I think it was 1 billion people without such access. It's now down to 700 million, in part because of Scott's efforts. He has also transformed how charities work in a lot of ways, bringing much more transparency. He's just a deeply inspiring figure, and he changes how I behave.
Now it's your turn. Record your own toast for consideration in a future episode at ketoasts.com. Thanks for joining us. And if you haven't already, go toast up some bread. Every positive action is worth toasting. I made homemade banana bread.
Oh, my least favorite thing. I call it garbage bread. Those things can't stand up. Like, those things look like they need to go in the trash.
That's hilarious.
Put them where they belong.
So I love banana bread, but I specifically love this very specific recipe that I make. That normal banana bread has 2 bananas. Mine has 6 bananas in it.
Oh no. That sounds